From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We hope that you and your family are safe, sheltering in place in a comfortable environment, and we look forward to greeting you back on the Yacht Club just as soon as conditions permit. Everybody who sails is thinking about global warming these days, and specifically about sea level rise. We have two speakers today to address that subject, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. With us today, we have Letitia Grenier, PhD and Chief Scientist of the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and Amy Hutzel, Deputy Executive Director of the State Coastal Conservancy. So we're very interested, Letitia, in your potential remedies for this big problem, and especially how what you do here might have application to other parts of the world. So welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thanks so much for having us here to talk about this today, Ron. We're excited to be telling people about the work we've been doing in terms of thinking about sea level rise adaptation for the Bay, and especially how we can use wetlands as a really important component of our strategy to protect people and infrastructure from the Bay, which is already rising. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about this report that we just came out with, and it's called Sediment for Survival. I want to acknowledge all the other co-authors and folks who contributed to it and funders. And this was really important to think about how can we create more resilient wetlands around the edge of the Bay that will then help protect us. And I'll get into more detail about that as we go along. Like all of our work, we had a lot of advisors to make sure that it was technically the best available science, and also that that science would apply very directly to management decisions. And so we always like to have both technical advisors and management advisors. And you can see that these are folks from all of the most important agencies that are trying to make decisions about what to do with sea level rise around the Bay. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today are these wetlands in the Bay called tidal marshes. And what a tidal marsh is a wetland where the tide comes in and out every day, twice a day here on the Pacific coast. And I'm sure for folks who sail out in the Bay, you've seen them. They look kind of like this low green, shaggy thing around the edges of the Bay. And they're actually extremely important and extremely valuable ecosystems. And the reason that people care about them so much, and we're working so hard to retain them and actually restore more of them, and Amy's going to tell you more about that, is that they help clean the water in the Bay. They actually do a lot of very valuable work for us in terms of dollars that way, and in terms of our health and for the health of wildlife. They provide flood control, which is a really big piece of this sea level rise question. And they make a home for food and providing food and housing for wildlife. And we have a lot of endangered species here in the Bay Area that live only in our tidal marshes and nowhere else in the world. And they're also really important for recreation and scenery. And actually, there's been more and more research on this, especially during COVID. We're all well aware of how important it is to get outside and interact with nature. And what the research has shown is that people who can get into places like our Bay wetlands, they actually function better, not just physically, but also mentally. So it's really good for our mental health and our cognition if we can get out into places like tidal marshes to have access to nature. So I'll tell you a little bit about the history of these wetlands in our Bay, and then give you a little bit more information about how they work and what they can do for us with sea level rise. So here's a map of the tidal marshes in San Francisco Bay in 1800. And you can see that there were quite a lot of them. And I'm going to show you where San Francisco is right here, Oakland is over here, and here's our big lower estuary of San Francisco Bay. We had almost 200,000 acres of tidal marsh back in the 1800s, and this was before European settlers came and really started changing what the landscape looked like. So if you fast forward to almost 200 years later, a lot of that tidal marsh was gone, and we had already actually even started restoring some of it here and there. And at this point, a lot of people came together to figure out what we could do to stop losing marsh and to stop making more marsh, because by this point, we'd recognized how important it was to get those services from our Bay tidal marshes. And so by 2009, a lot of work had started happening in that direction. And if I go back and forth, you can see that between 1998 and 2009, there was a huge increase in the amount of that light green, that restored tidal marsh, where people had purchased areas that were formerly tidal marsh, had been turned into something else, often a pond, maybe for salt production or for agriculture, had been dried out for agriculture, and they had returned them to tidal marsh. And not only that, but a lot more acres, if you look at this map, have been purchased and planned for future restorations. So you can see that if you look toward the future, we have a lot of really big plans for tidal marsh restoration. And in fact, this is a priority that the region has been working on with a lot of good collaboration between our agencies. And the reason, again, why that's happening is because the importance of these ecosystems for people and wildlife has been recognized for a long time. So here's another way of looking at what I just showed you in the previous maps, but looking at it now in a bar chart over time. So on the x-axis, we're looking from 1800, before major modification of the estuary by Europeans, to the present. And the last time these areas were mapped was in 2009. And then looking toward the future in terms of what the landscape will look like after all the lands that have been acquired and planned for restoration so far have been restored. And so when you're looking at the y-axis, you're looking at all the area of land, 100% of the land between high tide and low tide, if there were no levees preventing the tide from going where it wants to go. So historically, about most of that land was tidal marsh in 1800, around 190,000 acres of it. And a lot of that had been lost. And since we can't get back to that historical level, what we're trying to do is get to a goal of 100,000 acres, which is what the red dotted line is. And what you can see is that over time, there's been a huge gain in the amount of land that has been restored or is planned for restoration. And so this was a huge community effort that we are now all contributing to with our property taxes through the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority to bring back a healthy bay by restoring these lands. But there is a challenge, and the challenge is sea level rise. And the issue here is that if you think about where we are now in 2021, we're on a curve of sea level rise. And this information is from 2014. The latest science shows that sea level rise is likely to be more rapid than what you see here. So you can see that right now we're on this sort of gradual increase in sea level. Sea level's gone up around a foot over the last 100 years in San Francisco Bay. But as we get out more toward 2050 in the latter half of the century, that sea level rise is going to accelerate rather rapidly. And we could easily be looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 feet of sea level rise by 2100.
What's the source of this data?
These data are from the IPCC, which is a little bit outdated because it's from 2014. Now California does its own climate change assessment, which was most recently completed in 2019 with some advice from the Ocean Protection Council. And those are the numbers that people follow. And that's where it shows a little bit of a steeper increase in sea level rise than what we see here.
When you say an acronym like that, what's the IPCC?
The International Panel on Climate Change.
And then the 4 foot and 6.6, that's more recent California sources?
No, the most recent California state planning advice for climate change has higher levels. It's much, much more complicated and can't be easily shown in a curve like this, which is why I'm using the earlier image.
Great.
Thanks, Amy, for your help. The challenge for marshes as sea level rises is that they have to increase their elevation as the water level rises so that they can stay at the right elevation for the plants can grow relative to the water. And marshes are amazingly resilient and adaptive. They can actually accrete their own sediment and increase their own elevation. And they do that both with their own plant material and also with mud, essentially dirt carried in the water that deposits on the marsh and helps them grow in elevation as the water level rises. The issue is they need enough sediment to do that. So there was some modeling done by Point Blue that showed that if we have a low sediment supply, which is what we're looking at in this slide, and again, time is on the x-axis and the amount of marsh in hectares is on the y-axis. If you focus on the green bars, which is the amount of marsh, if we have a low sediment supply, which appears to be the situation we are in, as sea level rise continues, and we think sea level rise is high right now compared to what was originally projected, we end up losing marsh over time. And pretty much all of the models show that over decades and decades, sea level rise will outpace the ability of marshes to keep up. However, if we are in a high sediment supply scenario, the same models show that the marshes can keep up. So they have this resilient ability to grow their own elevation, but we have to give them the material to be able to do that. So that's what this study was about. It's all about where can we get that sediment from to provide enough supply so that the marshes can keep up with sea level rise and stay there at the edge of the bay, protecting our shorelines.
So let me see if I understand what you've just said, because it's quite intriguing. I think you said that marshes enable us to handle sea level rise better. And so if we restore the marshes or maintain healthy big marshes, we can better accommodate sea level rise. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And the next few slides get into that in a bit more detail. What these two slides talk about is how if we have enough sediment, the marshes will be able to keep up with sea level rise and still be there in 100 years. So that's why the report was about sea level rise. And I'm about to sort of go through some of the science of how that works.
So as sea level rises, you're saying that the marshlands get diminished, because pretty soon that buffer zone between land and the water, which is the marshes, those things get kind of wiped out, and they get absorbed, and pretty soon we don't have them as a buffer anymore.
Right. So as sea level rises, the marsh can drown. If here's the marsh and here's the water, and the water rises more rapidly than the marsh can drown. But if you give the marsh enough material, it has the ability to actually raise its own elevation and keep up with sea level rise. Let me explain a little bit how marshes work. Here's a picture of a marsh from Marin County, and this is the bay down here at the bottom. You can see that's this color. There's an extensive mud flat out here near the marsh. And what happens is you have sediment coming down from watersheds. So again, sediment is just dirt carried by water. Here it is coming down Galenas Creek. So the sediment comes into the bay from the creeks, and it stays in the bay for a while, sloshing around with the tides. And it might get deposited on a mud flat for a while. But then one day there's either a storm or it's a nice day with a lot of wind in the summer, and you start to get wind waves coming across the bay. They pick up the sediment. And then that sediment is now in the water column. And as the tide rises and the tide goes up and over the marsh, remember, this is the marsh right here. Here's the marsh with these long dendritic channels that kind of look like your arteries or something like that. The tide actually will completely cover the marshes at a very high tide. And when that water is carrying a lot of sediment, as you can imagine, it comes up on high tide, gets all the way to the top of high tide, stops, and then turns around, right? And the tide goes out. And at that moment of high slack tide, the water velocity is 0 and the sediment falls out. The water loses its energy, the sediment falls out, it stays on the marsh, and the marsh grows in elevation. And this is why having enough sediment in the water is really important, because that's what allows the marshes to keep growing vertically as sea level rises. And incidentally, it's also the reason that putting up a big barrier at the Golden Gate won't work. If we stop the high tides, we won't be able to keep our marshes. And as you can see, the marshes are right here protecting whatever's behind them. And I'll show you another picture of that, which is that if you imagine now we're looking at a cutaway view, here's the marsh with our pickleweed, marsh gum plant, and other native vegetation. And this broad expanse slopes down into the bay, and there's other elements of the marsh that help protect the marsh here, like eelgrass and oysters. And then behind the marsh, you have a slope up into the land and the upland. And what we have behind our marshes in San Francisco Bay are things like freeways, wastewater treatment plants, cities, Google, Facebook, really important and valuable infrastructure, neighborhoods, places that we don't want to flood. And if you have a nice big marsh like this, it absorbs the energy of the waves coming in, it reduces the erosion behind it. And what that means is that instead of having to build a big levee back here to protect whatever it is you're trying to protect, you can build a small levee and have a marsh in front of it. And so not only do you get to have a smaller levee to deal with sea level rise, but you get all the other benefits of the marsh in front, which, just to remind you, were things like processing nutrients and making the water cleaner, protecting endangered species, giving people a place to recreate, producing food for fish and wildlife. So there's a lot of other good reasons to have this marsh out here, but among them is that it does help protect against sea level rise. And to do that, we need to think about how marshes work in the larger landscape. And I think you said this earlier, Ron. This is this transitional area. Here's the flat marsh. There's those curvy channels again. And it's this transitional area between the land and between the bay. It's this transitional area that makes it so powerful, because it helps provide a lot of services by connecting land and water in a way where there's this sort of buffer in between the two. And so if we want to keep the marshes, we have to keep the processes that let the marsh live and thrive. And that means reconnecting our creeks so they deliver sediment and fresh water into the marsh, which helps the marsh grow in elevation. And it means keeping the tide, the full tidal influence, and the sediment that comes in from the tidal side, which helps the marsh grow in elevation and provide all the other services that we're interested in from the marsh. And so that's really the background of where we got to the point of realizing we needed to understand, do we have enough material, do we have enough mud or sediment to help the marshes that we have and the marshes that we plan to restore, help them keep up with sea level rise so that they can still be there into the future when we're going to need them even more to help protect against sea level rise and provide all of those other benefits. And so for the Sediment for Survival report, we asked ourselves these questions. How much sediment is needed to keep up with sea level rise until 2100? How much is available? And we kind of knew that we didn't have enough. And so we said to ourselves, how can we get more? How can we get as much as we need for these important habitats? And we considered various future scenarios because, of course, since the climate is changing, we have to understand what those futures are going to look like when we think about the sediment supply. And so things that can change into the future that we looked at in our scenarios are, we included the existing baylands, and by that we mean mud flats and marshes. So these are the wetlands between high tide and low tide. And we also considered the bigger extent of baylands we'll have when all the areas that have been purchased and planned for restorations are restored. So that's another 24,000 acres of restored baylands, marshes, and mudflats.
So let me ask, so there's 24,000 acres restoration. Now, this is land that you guys have already purchased and you have an intent to restore it in some ways. In other words, this is already purchased. And so I want to give credit to the entity that's already purchased this. Is this the Coastal Conservancy, or what is the organization that has purchased this 24,000 acres of potentially restored wetlands?
I'd say it's been a huge community effort over many decades. The Coastal Conservancy is a huge part of it. How would you answer that, Amy?
I'd say most of the lands are owned and managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then there are other landowners as well, including nonprofits like Sonoma Land Trust and Marin Audubon. The funding for the acquisition, a lot of it has come from state bond dollars, and other public and private funding sources have gone into the acquisition.
So this has been happening kind of behind the scenes for those of us John Q. Public people. I did not realize that some enlightened entity was buying baylands for restoration. This is good news. Seems like good news to me at any rate. SLR, help us recognize your acronyms. SLR stands for sea level rise.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of future scenarios, we also looked at 2 scenarios of sea level rise, looking at 1.9 feet of sea level rise, which we think is going to happen between now and 2050, and 5.0 feet of sea level rise, which will happen in the latter half of the century, most likely. So kind of looking at a near-term sea level rise scenario and a longer-term sea level rise scenario. And then we also looked at how climate change is affecting precipitation. One of the most clear predictions of climate change is that our storms are going to be bigger. We're probably going to have more drought in between the storms, but when we get storms, they're going to be bigger and more intense. And bigger and more intense storms can actually carry more sediment with them when they come. So that was really important to think about. And we looked at that for both sort of a couple of different global climate change models that provide maybe a slightly wetter future or a slightly drier future for the region. And what we came up with was a volume of sediment that is needed for tidal marshes and tidal flats to keep pace with sea level rise by 2100. I'm not going to show you the results from every single scenario because it's too overwhelming, but I'll show you the results for the scenario where we have, we're looking at the longer term by 2100, and we're looking at our existing mudflats and marshes plus those that we plan to restore. And what this is 450 million cubic yards of sediment, which is an enormous amount. It's enough to fill 45 million dump trucks, which would circle the equator 10 times if you put them nose to tail. So it's really quite a lot that is needed. And I'm going to start to break down this sediment amount and think about where could we get this amount from. So 30% of it we are already getting in the current landscape. If we change nothing, we think we would get 30%. And that's with our current landscape and management approaches. And we come by that via sediment that is naturally delivered from the creeks and the tides, as I talked about previously, and the rivers. And we also dredge several areas, mostly for navigation, also for flood control. And some of that dredge sediment is placed in areas where the land has sunk due to mostly because we've dried out wetlands. When wetlands dry out, they lose elevation. And so if we want to restore that area, we have to fill up the sort of hole that's been created by placing sediment there before the area is returned to the tides. And Amy's been involved in that quite a bit and can tell you how that works. So that accounts for about 30% of the sediment that's needed.
So currently, we at the Yacht Club have actually had multiple speakers come and talk to us about dredge spoils, which are deposited frequently at the southwestern corner of Angel Island and then frequently toward Harding Rock. And they've been thus far over the last several decades kind of regularly deposited inside the bay in deep spots to fill up what were thought to be holes in the bay where they thought they could easily drop these dredge spoils. What you're saying is rather than drop them in these locations in the middle of the bay where currents quickly distribute them around the bay again, you're saying instead, let's take them to the marshlands that we want to build up anyway. And instead of dropping dredge spoils in the middle of the bay, let's take them where we want them on the shoreline. Is that it?
Yeah. And I'm saying that's already happening for some proportion of those dredge sediments. It's called beneficial reuse. So the ones you're talking about are where the sediment is being treated as a waste product and they're kind of trying to blow it out the Golden Gate by putting it in those deep spots. But already a certain percentage of it is reused. It's called beneficial reuse for wetlands. And that makes up part of this 30% of the sediment that we need. And then to get the other 70%, we're going to need to use new management approaches to access more of our sediment from the bay and from the watersheds. And the things we need to do there are use additional dredge sediment to nourish our existing marshes. So not just filling up the holes of areas where we want to restore them back to the tide, but where we have existing marshes that we think can't keep up with sea level rise, we would want to slowly nourish them with added sediments. And those could come from the dredge sediments, exactly as you were saying, Ron. Instead of depositing them in deep areas of the bay where we hope they'll get washed out the Golden Gate, we could reuse those sediments to nourish our baylands that we have.
So when you deposit dredge sediments on an existing marsh, what about the plant life or vegetation which is growing right there?
Absolutely. That's a complicated issue and it requires more study. We think the best way to do it is we're calling it nourishing existing marshes, where you try to essentially mimic the natural process of the sediment bringing in the tide, the way I talked, being brought in on the tide, the way I talked about earlier. The closer we can come to that, the better outcomes we're going to get. There are definitely places where they have sprayed like a foot of sediment onto a marsh and sort of rapidly accreted, up to several inches or a foot very quickly. That is, of course, as you would imagine, very challenging for all the life in the marsh that's there right then. A lot of plants can survive that. It's not clear, how many of our native animals would be able to survive that. So that would require more study. But what we're looking at is some innovative ways to deliver that sediment where you would essentially be injecting the sediment into a tide as it comes in so that tide, the right tide is carrying a high sediment load, or perhaps you would place the sediment in a shallow part of the bay, but in the right place hydrodynamically so that the tides would then pick it up and move it to where we want it. None of these solutions are perfect, and the Army Corps is working on studying them. In addition to using more of the dredge sediments that are coming out of navigation dredging and other dredging in the bay, we also probably need to access the massive amount of dirt that is excavated in construction projects in the uplands around the bay. And this would be another pretty innovative approach because we're not generally using that kind of material for wetland restoration or wetland nourishment, but we may need to study that and pilot some approaches because there is just an enormous amount of that material. A lot of it right now goes to landfill, and instead it could be used to help protect our shorelines in this way. We would also like to access reservoir sediment. So as we dammed our rivers, a lot of sediment got trapped behind those dams in the reservoirs. It's not useful for water supply because it's taking up space where we would like to be storing water for people. And so if there was a way to either reconfigure those dams. A lot of them needed to be retrofitted anyway for earthquakes. If there'd be a way to set the water from lower in the dam, that water lower in the water column carries a lot more sediment. There's also been some ideas about having sort of separate pathways to slurry sediment out of the dams. That could be a really powerful way to deliver sediment to the baylands. So another way to look at this is that what are the management actions that can get us toward healthy and resilient baylands? And we can use this kind of simple three-legged stool idea of how to do it. One thing we can do is really rethink how we reuse dredged sediment, and Amy can talk about this quite a bit. There's been a lot of work on trying to improve some of the policies around this. And that's something we can do quickly and rather soon, hopefully. But we also need to use some of the longer term strategies, because just dredged sediment is not going to get us where we need to be in terms of the amount of material that we need for our marshes to keep up with sea level rise. So we also need to think about something called migration space. And we haven't talked about this yet in this particular talk, which is that marshes, not only will they naturally grow vertically, but they can actually move inland as sea level rises. They will laterally move as the level of the bay rises, but we need to give them space to do that. So most of our areas have levees right at the edge of the tides, and so the marshes can't move inland. So we may need to actively think about conserving the space we have left for marshes to migrate, and also possibly creating it, because that's a lot easier than finding a lot of sediment potentially if the land is available. So we can think about migration space as a strategy for this in the medium term. And then in the long term, we need to get toward watershed management, which are some of those ideas about using excavated dirt, getting the sediment out from behind dams, reconnecting our rivers and creeks better into our bay wetlands so that they can nourish them with sediment and fresh water. And we know that it takes a long time to reconfigure landscapes, so we may be looking at a few decades for that to happen. So we made a graphic of what this looks like, thinking about a cutaway across the watershed. I'm not going to walk through each of these items, but the reason we broke it down this way is so that, because the way we have managed our jurisdictions in terms of the government of the Bay Area, out here you have the Army Corps with jurisdiction over dredging, and up here you're going to have something totally different, a water district with jurisdiction over how a reservoir is managed. So for each part of the watershed, there's actions that the agencies are otherwise responsible. But in terms of the simple three-legged stool, we can think about near term, how do we reuse dredged sediment from the bay more effectively and reuse more of it? How can we start to protect and purchase migration space so marshes can move? And how can we redesign and manage our watersheds so that we can sort of get all the value out of them in terms of the reservoir sediment and water and all the other things we can do in watersheds to push that sediment down toward the bay and help protect our shoreline and by having our marshes stay into the future. And if it's useful in the question period, I'm happy to go into the details of this, but I want to give Amy time to talk.
Wow. So can you go back one slide?
Sure.
Okay, so migration space. Mm-hmm. So would the plan be to buy private land that is just above the marshes and to basically convert that land into some restorable above the marshland area? Is that what you do there?
Yes, and it's happening already. Amy can probably give you some good examples, but Sonoma Land Trust has done this where you really don't have to do much other than take away any barriers and take away any levees that are preventing the tide from getting to those areas. Priority number one, I think, is protecting what's left. And then in the future, unfortunately, we may be in the situation of managed retreat where we have to move back infrastructure from the bay because we can't protect every inch of the shoreline. And that'll be sort of the next wave of opportunity to think about that.
Holy cow. I'm all ears on what you guys can do to defend against the rise in sea level that seems inevitable. Thanks, Letitia, for introducing Amy Hutzel, Deputy Executive Director of the State Coastal Conservancy. Amy, welcome as well to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks to the St. Francis Yacht Club for having Letitia and I come to speak on wetlands restoration in San Francisco Bay. I'm with the State Coastal Conservancy. We do coastal restoration, protection, public access projects up and down the coast of California and here in the San Francisco Bay. And today I'm going to talk about some specific restoration projects going on in San Francisco Bay, mostly just to illuminate what we are accomplishing. Then I'm going to talk about beneficial use of dredged sediment. So the idea is, instead of taking the dredged sediment from our ports and marinas and putting it at in-bay disposal sites, or taking it 50 miles off the Golden Gate Bridge to the deep ocean disposal site, using that sediment for our wetland restoration goals. And finally, I'll talk about some of the funding mechanisms and the funding picture for wetlands restoration and beneficial use. And really, what we're trying to do is restore what was once here, these large areas of vegetated tidal marsh that surrounded San Francisco Bay. We lost somewhere between 85 and 90% of our tidal wetlands between, the gold rush and middle of last century. Lost those wetlands to development, to agriculture, to salt ponds. And we've been working over the last few decades to acquire the lands needed to do restoration, and actually moving forward with tidal wetlands restoration projects. And having been involved in a lot of these projects, I would say they are relatively straightforward. This is not as difficult, say, as restoring a redwood forest. You need to have the right template in place, create the right template, and then allow natural processes to take over for the restoration. And really, the most critical parts are the elevation of the site and the sediment, either sediment brought in beforehand to raise the elevation, or the sediment that comes in naturally with the tides to raise the elevation. And once the site is at the right elevation, then much of the vegetation occurs naturally. So, and this happens relatively quickly. We've restored salt ponds in the South Bay within a matter of a few years. They were vegetating with marsh plants, and within 5 or 6 years, there were already endangered species, ridgeways rails, and salt marsh harvest mice using the marshes. So this is a totally doable effort, and the payoffs are huge. So some of the projects that have been going on in the San Francisco Bay include the South Bay salt ponds. This is 15,000 acres of salt ponds that were acquired from Cargill in 2003. They are now owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we've been working in a phased approach to restore these salt ponds to tidal wetlands. We are keeping some of the ponds as managed ponds because they're very attractive to some migratory birds, but are working to restore at least 50% of the salt ponds to tidal marsh habitat, and have been making great progress. Another fantastic project is Dotson Family Marsh on the Richmond shoreline. And this is an environmental justice project. East Bay Regional Park District actually had to use eminent domain to take the property, buy the property, and restore it to tidal wetlands. And Whitney Dotson, the older gentleman in the middle of this photo, worked tirelessly over many decades to ensure that this land just off of Parchester Village, north of Richmond, was protected and restored for the adjacent community and for the health of the bay. just down the shoreline from Dotson Marsh is Lower Walnut Creek. And this photo of this breach event what is less than a week and a half old. So very recently, this site was opened back up to the tides, but it took decades to get to this point. And it was Contra Costa County Flood Control District working first to decertify the levee along Lower Walnut Creek that the Corps of Engineers had built many, many, many years ago. And then designing a wetland restoration project. So in this case, it's an instance of our old ways of engineering not working for our present day needs. And the restoration of Lower Walnut Creek actually opens up the mouth of Walnut Creek and improves flood protection as well as improving habitat. On the Sonoma Bay Lands, the Sonoma Land Trust worked to restore Sears Point, which is this watery area in the middle with these kind of strange dots in it. And what I would say about this project is it's an example of a subsided area. This area was used for agriculture. Sonoma Land Trust acquired it and worked to restore it.
What is a subsided area?
Yeah, so a lot of the lands around San Francisco Bay that were once tidal marshes, once they are diked off, levied off from San Francisco Bay, they tend to sink. So they can be lower than sea level. And that can happen when they're dried out, when they're used for agriculture. It happens in the South Bay due to groundwater extraction that occurred, last century. So we have a lot of lands around San Francisco Bay that are actually lower than sea level. And if we just opened up those lands to the tides, they might never evolve to vegetated tidal marsh. So we need that sediment either naturally or bringing it in order to be able to restore the sites. And at Sears Point, they used this very innovative technique. They really were testing it out of putting in all of these little islands within the site. So instead of bringing in a huge amount of sediment, which has a cost to it, they pushed around the sediment on the site to create these little islands. And that way, when the waters come in with the tide, the islands slow down the waters. And when that happens, sediment falls out of the water. So the design was intended to accelerate accretion of sediment within the site. And you can compare that to the site just to the left, which is Sonoma Bay Lands. And that is a project by the State Coastal Conservancy and the Corps of Engineers from long ago. It was built during the Clinton administration. And the reason I know that is because Al Gore came to the opening ceremony when he was vice president, which was super exciting. But at that site, at Sonoma Bay Lands, it was the first project in San Francisco where we took dredge sediment and we took it from the Port of Oakland when they were deepening to minus 42 feet. And brought it to Sonoma Bay Lands. And by we, I don't mean I had anything to do with it. It was before my time, but many people were involved. And ultimately, it was the dredgers and the contractors who brought the sediment to the site, built up the elevation of the site, and then breached the levee and restored it to tidal waters. And the site has, there were a lot of doubters about whether this would work. There were lots of questions, from the quality of the mud and sediment to the loss of the existing habitat that was on the site, very, low quality seasonal wetlands, but it was habitat. So there were a lot of questions about whether it would work, whether it was, over-engineered. That was a term that was placed on the project.
So my question is, how long does it take to revegetate an area like the one shown on the right? If you actually were to carve out a place like we've seen in Dubai right now, how long does it take to get vegetation and sea life and, little microbes and so on to be growing again where all those people are standing, for that to turn back into a marshland? Is this a 2-year, 5-year, 6-month? How long does it take?
I would say it starts immediately. As soon as the site is open to the tides, there are things coming in on those tidal waters that are creating a tidal marsh. I mean, we saw this at Hamilton Restoration. We saw this in the South Bay. You're getting aquatic species immediately using these sites. In terms of it vegetating,
so immediately meaning within months or weeks? Is that what you're saying? Weeks or months?
It can start. It depends on the elevation of the site. So if the site is deeply subsided, then first it needs to fill with sediment. If the site is at the right elevation for marsh plants, then it's going to start immediately to vegetate. And, I would say at some of these sites, within a decade, you're looking at a fairly healthy marsh. It's not a fully mature ancient marsh like we see, like Petaluma Marsh is a really good example on the Petaluma River of an ancient marsh in San Francisco Bay, a large ancient marsh.
How old is it? How old is that marsh?
I think it's probably about 10,000 years old. Letitia, I don't know. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, they're probably, the full expanse of it that we see now is probably 3,000 years old, but during the ice ages, the marshes were expanding and contracting. So there's probably elements of it that are 10,000 years old.
Wow, that's amazing. So a marsh, I'm not used to thinking in terms of millennia. Okay, got it. And what you're saying is that as soon as we create this restored marshland as shown in your photograph right here, it starts to restore itself, just like weeds grow in the backyard if you don't weed them. Got it.
Tidal waters are delivering a lot of what the marsh needs to grow. And then the marsh, in turn, is rewarding San Francisco Bay with, a lot of detritus and primary productivity. So these marshes, are the lungs of the San Francisco Bay.
Okay, great.
So yeah, I mean, in this photo, we're seeing two different examples of how to address that need for sediment.
What are those little pieces that were planted? What do they do there? Do they drop dredge spoils to above sea level amount or what? How'd they get there? How did those little tan looking splotches get in the water?
They are islands of dirt from the site, and they, simply bulldozers and excavators pushing the dirt around on the site to create these islands. And the islands were created in order to slow down the waters as they come into the site, the tidal waters, so that the sediment would fall out. When water slows down, sediment drops.
Particulate matter settles, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, you were circling any one of these little white or tan colored little islands. So are you saying a bulldozer from the left side of the picture at low tide pushed out here and then made a peak, made a little hill that was higher than sea level there? Is that how those were formed? Or were
right. It just used the dirt on site. So it was just, moving dirt around on the site to create the little islands, that are higher than sea level.
So the picture to the left is an after picture of a natural sediment, and the picture to the right with all the little tan colored dots, that's us trying to recreate what we have on the left. Is that what you're saying?
It's the picture on the left is a wetland restoration project that was that was created using dredge sediment from the Port of Oakland. So with that site, Sonoma Bay Lands, we brought in the dirt with barges and offloaders and pipes. With the project on the right side, instead of the expense of bringing in dredge sediment, they're trying to capture the sediment that's in the bay naturally. So it's two different ways of capturing sediment. But yeah, what we're trying to achieve on the right is to have it look like the marsh on the left. Which was also that, it was one of our first restoration projects in San Francisco Bay, and the first using dredge sediment.
So the news for many of our viewers is there are people such as organizations you represent who are thinking about ways to restore our marshlands to the benefit of the broader community. And there are multiple technologies that you're exploring to basically reuse the dredge spoils in a way to help us accelerate the restoration of wetlands.
Exactly. That's exactly it. There is a small group of people in San Francisco Bay who spend a lot of their time thinking about how to restore wetlands in San Francisco Bay and how to capture the sediment that we need to restore these wetlands.
How many dollars have been spent so far to buy land, and how many in these restoration projects over the last couple of decades?
I don't have the exact figure, but it is hundreds of millions of dollars at this point. And a lot of that is state bond funding. So we've had resource bonds that have passed over the last 20, 25 years in the state of California. And those state bond dollars have really benefited San Francisco Bay. And then there have also been federal dollars. And that's like Hamilton Wetlands in the city of Novato in Marin County. This is a project of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Coastal Conservancy, a former military base. This was the runway at the airfield. And we took the site, brought in 6 million cubic yards of dredge sediment, mostly from the Port of Oakland's minus 50-foot deepening project, sculpted the sediment, breached to the bay. We breached in 2014. And the
entrance to the bay so that water could run off into the bay. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So water could come from the bay. So that, you see this slough opening, this opening right here to the bay. Sorry about the dog.
It sounds like that was a supportive bark, I'm guessing.
It's a supportive bark. My dog is definitely pro wetlands restoration, that's for sure. And my kids are too, if you hear them. So yeah, this site had not seen bay waters for over 100 years. And in 2014, we breached the levee that separated the site from San Francisco Bay after we filled the site in with mud from the Port of Oakland. And the site is responding really well. And we've had bat rays, and we've seen some oysters in the site, thousands and thousands of migratory shorebirds and waterfowl. So, it's evolving to tidal marsh habitat.
The shape of the slough that you've drawn there, very artsy looking. Is that one that you guys created, or is that just an idea graphically of what could happen?
That is what we've created out on the site. And, we're mimicking nature. Hamilton Wetlands is on top of an airfield, though. I mean, the runway is still it's there underneath, many feet of mud from the Port of Oakland.
Great, terrific.
I highly recommend, this is a great spot to go visit and see a wetland restoration project. And it's got just over 2 miles of Bay Trail. It's the San Francisco Bay Trail, and you can park like here. There's a parking lot, I think, up here somewhere.
What exit do you get here? How do you get to this spot?
You take the Hamilton Belmar Keys exit. There's some great overlooks and hiking.
So for our viewers, you go north on Highway 101 and around Novato, you'll see a Hamilton exit. If you go right and or east out of that exit, you keep going toward what destination? You know where you're going here, Amy. So tell a viewer how they would go.
Yeah, go to the hangars. These are the old hangars from when this was an air base, and you can park. There's public parking here, and you can look this up on Google Maps. Hamilton Wetlands.
Wonderful, great. What do you think the cost of that piece that we're looking at there is? Give us cost of buying the land and then restoring the wetlands to it.
Yeah, the land was $1 from the it was part of the base reuse and closure, the BRAC process. So this was a federal military base. They closed down, just like many of the bases around San Francisco Bay, and much of the land was redeveloped. There's housing, businesses at Hamilton now, but the runway was transferred for $1 to the State Coastal Conservancy, and then we worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to restore it. The total cost of the restoration was well over $100 million. That cost was primarily bringing in the dredge sediment from the Port of Oakland. It's not inexpensive to move dredge sediment around in San Francisco Bay. It's not inexpensive to dredge it in the first place, and then to take it somewhere and place it. There's a cost to that too.
So a buddy of mine on the East Coast, David Rockefeller Jr., they spent a lot of energy, he and his dad, buying land in Maine and New England to basically restore it. And that would represent private funding. What percent of the funding of your projects is coming from private sources like that versus public?
Yeah, most of it is public funding. In the South Bay, the Hewlett, the Packard, the Moore Foundations, and the Goldman Fund put in, I believe it was a total of 35 or 40 million into the acquisition and the early planning. So with that project, there were private funds that went into it. That is not a common example around San Francisco Bay. It has primarily been state and federal funding, and then I'll talk in a little bit about Measure AA, which is a regional funding measure that passed in 2016. What we are working towards now with the Corps of Engineers is increasing the amount of beneficial use in San Francisco Bay. And this was a proposal that we submitted to the Corps of Engineers, and that was selected as one of 10 pilot projects across the nation. The red lines show the federal navigation channels that are part of the proposal. And then the purple and brown areas show sites where we would like to use the sediment. These are the federal dredge sites that we included in our proposed beneficial use project: Oakland, Richmond, Redwood City Harbor, and Pinole Shoal. And if you look over here, these are the volumes in cubic yards that are dredged typically on an annual basis. Redwood City Harbor is every 2 years, but most of these dredged annually. So it's a very large volume of dredge sediment each year. And then this column shows where that dredge sediment typically goes. So a lot of the sediment, these two large dredge projects, go 50 miles off the Golden Gate to the deep ocean disposal site. Some of the dredging is disposed of in bay, near Alcatraz or San Pablo Bay. These sites in bay are not really helping the sediment situation in San Francisco Bay. They're not dispersive sites that are, feeding our marshes and mudflats. So we really want to see as much of this material as possible going to our wetland restoration projects. In our proposal, we had several sites, restoration sites. These are all three of these are in the North Bay. That could accept dredge sediment. And you can see the sediment capacity here. I mean, it would take years and years at 1.5 million cubic yards a year to fill these three sites alone. And then we achieve almost 5,000 acres of restoration. Another part of the project with the Corps of Engineers, which the Corps is working on now, is this strategic aquatic placement testing. So instead of getting the material all the way to the wetland restoration site, and that's the really expensive part, is the pipe and the booster pump and the electricity to get it over here. Instead of doing that, are there places in San Francisco Bay where you could drop dredge sediment and it would move with the tides onto the marshes and mudflats? And this would be a lower cost way in the long term of feeding our marshes and mudflats. So we are working with the Corps right now to study this at a couple different sites in San Francisco Bay.
So instead of going all the way ashore and disposing of dredge spoils, you're saying some site offshore a bit. Who knows how far? In this case, it's boat lengths, 4 or 5 boat lengths. You pour tons and tons of sediment there, and then it dissipates. Some goes back out and some goes inland. Okay.
Yeah. So I just wanted to end by talking about some of the funding sources that we've used for wetland restoration. And first off, Measure A, which is a $12 per year parcel tax for restoration around San Francisco Bay. And it passed in 2016, over 70% voter support in the 9-county Bay Area. So far, the board of the authority has authorized $117 million in projects, and we continue to run grant rounds and have another 15 years of funding. And then currently, there's significant state and federal funding. The governor's climate package, which he signed back in September, includes $500 million for our agency, the State Coastal Conservancy, for coastal resilience. That's up and down the coast and in the Bay Area. And then $100 million for the Ocean Protection Council for ocean and coastal health. Again, up and down the California coast. But these are funding sources we can tap into for our wetlands restoration. As of mid-November, the president has signed the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which has close to $13 billion for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to do construction. And $2 billion of that is for aquatic ecosystem restoration projects. So we are working really hard to make sure that Belmer Keys, our South Bay Salt Ponds project, and this beneficial use pilot program are recipients of the federal infrastructure dollars. And then another funding source is the US EPA's San Francisco Bay program, which we're working with our senators and Congresswoman Spear to increase that program and have it be a bit more on par with Puget Sound, Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, some of these other geographic programs around the country. So with that, thank you very much, and I can definitely answer any questions.
So how often do you go out and enjoy the habitat that you helped to restore?
It's funny that you would ask, because just on Saturday, my husband and my youngest son and my dog and I went out to Heron's Head Park in San Francisco at sunset, and it was just beautiful, beautiful, and walked out on the Bay Trail.
Where is Heron's Head Park?
I believe it's owned by the Port of San Francisco, and it's in Southeast San Francisco. It's like the Bayview, Hunters Point community. But you take Cargo Boulevard off of 3rd Street. And it's kind of tucked in. There's like some sort of compost facility or landfill sort of facility there. That's where the old PG&E plant used to be, that is now gone. A big native plant nursery right there too.
So it's east of 3rd Street in Hunters Point, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's east of 3rd Street in Hunters Point.
Well, thank you very much. You and Letitia are doing God's work, and we sailors and people in the yachting community all benefit from the restoration of wetlands around San Francisco Bay. It's been fascinating to listen to how much has been going on, without us knowing about it. Thanks so much for sharing your story with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks to the St. Francis Yacht Club.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.